Howard clutched the newspaper between his wrinkled fingers, squinting at the small section of the opinion page. Plantoids, the dark side of the phenomenon. April 14th, 1981, exactly 1 year ago today, the tiny town of Trovigo, just off the coast of Italy, wakes up to an incredible sight. Beside the forgotten church in the center of town, the local graveyard has sprouted into an enormous mass of native flora. The official measurements coming in at the 4 stories tall and 50 meters wide. To those who were the first to witness the growth, wasted no time in calling it from a gift from God. Even before the international press rolled on and the entire town was sealed off for the government investigation, the coach driver swerved off to a particularly troublesome pothole, an impact jolting the paper from Harold's grasp. It landed on the seat next to him with a small poof of dust, adding to the already stale air and making him feel like he needed to sneeze. The driver flashed an apologetic look, Harold meeting it with a strained smile before scooping the paper back up into his hands. Within a day, the world's best and brightest scientists were pouring in. They all had their minds on the exact same conundrum. How could such a large growth of healthy, thriving plant life spring up and seemingly overnight? Early analysis of the soil surrounding the growth and inclusive, it seemed to have hold no special qualities compared to samples of nearby, unaffected by soil. But of course, the answer didn't take long to emerge, yet rather than bring a logical explanation, it only served to raise more confusion. He flicked his thumb across the tongue and turned to the page. He knew what had to be close. The road was getting more and more uneven, and the engine was wheezing with each turn, and the sweat of the brow of the driver growing even more apparent. Silently he turned and scanned his eyes over the empty seats. At the end of the line, it had been quite some time ago. The roots of the mass weren't coming from the soil, the article continued. They were coming from the coffins. The roots infused with every bones of the graveyard skeletons. You reading the papers? The driver spoke with a slightly country drawl. His words tingled with every nervous energy. My own article got published a few days ago. Thought I would appreciate it if you keep your focus on the road. Howard shot a stern glare into the rear view mirror, smothering the paper out from his lap. Right. Sorry, gotta focus. It took less than a week to similar instances of all the different sizes to start popping up all over the world. Age and condition matter not, and as the scientists quickly discovered, for as long as they were real bones from a real dead human, they were sprouting from flora. It seemed like an ordinary life was put on standstill as people raced to discover these plantoids, and they were promptly named. Even now it remains a prominent topic of interest. So a year ago since that fatal day in Italy, what do we know? Well, no official explanation has been released. As far as the average person knows, the residents of Trovago were on the spot of the first assumption. Cleanup crews have been immobilized across the globe to take care of the most inconvenient growths, while they founded organizations work for the preservation for others. There had been a nature-based religious movement swept up into chaos. With numbers growing by the day, experts were estimating that there may be millions of plantoids left to discover, and millions more lurking up underground. Slowly but surely, people were adjusting to the sight of the towering stack of flowers in their neighborhood. But deep down, there were a few unsettling concepts that they've been tugging at the back of our minds this entire time. Whatever the nature of this event may be, the spectacle of it all seemed to have distracted us from the undisturbing questions we need to ask ourselves. Why are the plantoids popping up in locations never before inhabited by humans? Why were there some becoming seemingly privatized, hushed away from public view? Why have we found in the Antarctica as certain rumors had claimed. It seemed that whatever the case of these phenomenon, the powers of those have been reluctant to answer these questions. I implore you, readers, next time you see a plantoid, stop and think about what could be underneath and how much they met such a fate. We're here. The coach came to the stop. Howard tossed the paper aside and eased himself into a standing position with the help of his cane, his ceramic hip clicking quietly with each step. He walked to the driver's booth, where a twitchy, red-headed teen was waiting for his payment. "I can't take you back, remember?" he spoke, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel. There was an awkward air to the boy's mannerisms, like there wasn't never quite able to keep still. "It was risky enough getting you out of there in the first place, and I'm not waiting around for you to do whatever you want to do." "I know," Howard said, taking a wad of cash from his pocket. "That is what we agreed on." The boy took the cash into his pocket, glancing at the grubby windows for any sign of trouble. The vast expanse of nature around them remained completely empty, save for the few birds and foxes. There wasn't another soul in the sight. "Thanks for keeping your side of the deal. I really need this money. Hey, you used to live here, right? Can you tell me why you had to close this place down before you go?" "Just out of curiosity, because there have been all sorts of rumors flying around for decades now, and I don't know what to believe. An accident at a nearby random mine," Howard explained. "Too much radiation. Long-term exposure would have been fatal. Everyone had to go." "But not everyone went, right? I paid you to drive, not to ask questions." "Sorry," the boy spoke, sinking a little into his chair. He puffed a short sigh. I gotta get back home. Town I picked you up from is a good few miles away, and I'm running low on gas, so I don't have much to waste. See ya." "Goodbye." Howard turned and stepped onto the dusty soil, the coach doors closing behind him with a final nod. The driver revved the engine back to life and drove off back into the country road. He sighed and gazed out across the town before him. After all these years, it felt so good to be back. "Don't go talking to Creepy Fred," as well-known saying as the locals of St. Anthony. It was one of the first things Howard noticed, walking towards the beginning of his visit to town, and it had proved to be the sentiment that was difficult to forget. Fred Hazelton was St. Anthony's blemish, its imperfection. His presence was known universally amongst the town's occupants, but most of them seemed reluctant to even acknowledge him. It was as if silent mutual agreement had been made to avoid the man at all cost, to pretend that he didn't exist, and for all Howard knew, he might as well not have, for he apparently spent most of his time cooped up in a dilapidated mansion next to the local cemetery on the outskirts of town. Howard pondered his thoughts as he plunged a mouthful of juicy chicken past his lips. The dinner invitation he had received from a local mother and her husband had been tempting enough to accept. "We hope you're enjoying this town so far," the mother spoke, smiling warmly as she tucked a spoonful of rice. "Absolutely," said Howard. "It's much nicer here than the city. All the pollution, concrete, and numbness you can get sometimes. Small, cozy places like St. Anthony just fits me much better." The husband nodded in agreement. "Are you planning on staying much longer?" "Only for a few days at most. I'm waiting on a call from this writing agency. They're considering my application. I'll be gone for the day I hear back from them." "Well, we wish you the best of luck." The thought of Fred remained embedded in Howard's mind, conversed a bit of how much mundane matters. Fred Hazelton, strange how it was, with some hesitant so much to mention the man's name, and him still being the subject of countless rumors. "What's up with that reclusive guy, Fred? I think his name was," he spoke, unable to keep the thought from occupying the space of his tongue. Instantly, the family's demeanors turned colder, as if simply speaking the man's name, he had invited some dark shadow upon the house. Neither the woman nor her husband wished to speak first, yet the latter took it upon himself to answer the question. "Don't tell anyone we told you this, but Fred," Fred's a bit of an odd case, he whispered, leaning down towards the table. There's reports of him on the cemetery almost every night. Out the shambles, at the most ungodly hour, creeping around the tall grass and the leafless trees. It's a little strange, to say the least. Reports? Howard inquired. Why was he out so late at night? His mama's buried there, his wife spoke. In the cemetery, she lived in the mansion right up the hill until she passed away last year. Nice woman, only slightly less shut in than Fred, but still, she used to bake this little snowy cupcakes for all of us at Christmas. Fred moved in a couple of days after her funeral. Apparently she left him everything in the will. The house, her money, her possessions, you name it. She came from a very wealthy family. She let out a slight sigh, allowing herself to drift away for a moment. It's such a shame Fred never put any of that money in to keep the mansion upkeep. It's used for a very pretty building. Look, between you and us, we think he's a weirdo, the husband spoke, in a restraining tone. He stays in that dusty old hole all day and only comes out in the dead of light like a vampire. Looks like a vampire, too. He's probably still living off whatever supplies that old hag stashed underground before she wasted away. Honey, do you think he cares about what everyone says about him? About his reputation, I mean? Ha, the husband replied, smirking slightly. His knife scraped against the plate as he tore off another piece of meat from the bone. Of course not. I can't remember the last time he spoke to any of us. Mikey at school says that he spoke to Mr. Hazelton once. The couple's kid spoke up last, playing with the little greens on his plate. When he saw him sitting by upstairs window, Mikey says he asked Mr. Hazelton if he was a ghost. Did he say anything back? The mother inquired. Nah, he just looked at him all funny and went back inside the house. Creep, the husband muttered under his breath. Fred's antics meant the cemetery was seldom visited by locals, and yet when Howard paid a visit, it seemed well kept. The vegetation had grown cleared, the tombstones were clean, and a fresh pile of flowers was sitting on Miss Hazelton's grave, not in a bouquet or vase or any sort of container, just scattered slightly across the soil, a mass of poppies and scattering of daffodils. Howard was intrigued. The fact that Fred's behavior could very well have been a grieving man mourning the death of his much-loved mother, and nothing more seemed to occur to anybody. Either they didn't know or that they didn't care, and it felt unfair to Howard that no one was even attempting to reach out to the man to establish any sort of connection. Needless to say, it came as a huge shock when he received a dinner invitation from Fred early one morning, written in his very own handwriting. Newcomer, it all read, in slanted font, with the exaggerated curves, like what a person attempting to write formally, but has not do in such a way of shaping their letters. I have noted your arrival in town and would like to properly introduce myself. I understand you may have certain things about me from the other residents here, and as unflattering as they may be, I can assure you in a good portion that these claims are entirely untrue. I would deem as most satisfactory if you were to come to the dinner tonight and establish at 6 p.m., where I am sure to have a polite chat about said rumors in a sensible manner. Yours endearly, Frederick Hazelton. Howard was flabbergasted, to say the least. A few horrible thoughts came upon him of being stalked and spied on, but he soon reminded himself not to jump into conclusions. He was living relatively close to Fred. It was perfectly reasonable of him to simply observe his invitation into town as anyone else. He couldn't have been a definitive judgment from the man until he met him in person, and this was the perfect opportunity to do so. It seemed likely that locals would do nothing but discourage him if he did dare tell him about the invitation. So he kept the information to himself. The hours passed by no time at all, and quickly he found the sun dipping below the ledge of the horizon. Slipping into some formal attire, he readied himself for the occasion, brushing his teeth and taking one last good look at the mirror before he ventured outside. He had never been up close to the house before, and it's revealing itself to be in a greater state of disrepair than he intentionally observed. It was somewhat isolated from the rest of the town, obscured from all the sides, its front by a cluster of thick willow trees, but the remains of what had once been a well-kept building had all but faded away. The windows were cracked and foggy, a film of dirt and grime covering the outer layers of glass. Brickwood was surrounded by ivy. A light scattering of collapsed roof tiles were displayed across the roof of the building, little specks of darkness sucking up the moonlight. Nevertheless, the inside lights were on, and the great rusted knocker on the front door felt cold and rough in Howard's hand as he dropped it against the wood. Slow, irregular footsteps came down the hallway. Howard swallowed and put on a warm smile, forcing his hands away and retreating to his side trouser pockets. The door caught on the chain lock as it opened, and as he heard soft breathing coming from the inside of his footsteps, it came to an end. "This is the oldest building in St. Anthony, you know." Fred's head had slipped into a gap, and unnoticeably, he hadn't seen him for a good few seconds. His face was shrouded by the night, his eyes wide like a cat's as he stared from the crevice. His voice was delicate and precise as he spoke. With a hint of English accent, it cut through the cricket's chirps like a knife as Howard stood there nervously, unsure of how to respond. "It predicts the town itself. It was built by my great-great-grandfather, and the rest of St. Anthony was formed outwards from it." The wind whistled along with the street as a few more awkward silence passed by. Howard took a step forward, ready to say something, but finding the words to be caught on his tongue. "I do hope you will excuse its current condition. It is not that I don't care about the well-being of this house or its history. I'm just not a very handy man myself, and I would have hired someone to come to work for me. But I have been busy as of late, and I'm not exactly a very social person either, if you could not tell already." "May I come in?" Howard finally forced out. "Yes, please, and make yourself at home." The chain came off the latch with a metallic click, and he waited for Fred to pull open the door for the rest of the way. But instead he heard his footsteps leading back to the house. Grasping the knob, he pushed it open, and it was mildly started to be a sudden slamming behind his back as he entered the mansion. The first thing he noticed in the air was the instantly recognizable qualities of the fresh mist of Febreze, and almost overpoweringly so. He swallowed and wrinkled his nose, hoping whatever Fred had disappeared to hadn't noticed his recoiling. "I'm afraid you must forgive me for the aroma." Howard heard his voice echoed from the next rooms over. "A nasty settlement of rats had recently invaded the mansion, although I was capable of driving them off. Their pungent odor remained, a bitter breath of mild chemicals, then a breath of rat droppings. Fred's voice had been on the edge of humor. Even as Howard cringed at the thought, he sniffled as a little harder, and indeed he could detect some other scent, overshadowed by the smell of what he presumed to be exotic flower. "The food is all set out to be ready to eat. Please come in and join me in the living room." The image of Fred, hiding around the corner, brandished a meat cleaver, popped into Howard's head, as well as one of them leaning over his plate with a devilish grin, sprinkling cyanide on his food. Again, he was forced to reassure himself that it was going to be a perfectly normal night. They would eat, share a conversation, and he would leave. Nothing more, nothing less. Warily, he started walking down the hallway. The rug puffed out dust and is around his ankles in every step, despite the extravagant, its significantly faded exterior, and the interior structure of the house seemed to be quite simple. There was a central hallway, which led from the front door to the base of the stairs, and the 4 doors along the way, 2 on each side. 3 were shut and presumably locked, and the other one on the further right-hand side was slightly ajar, casting a rack of light against the opposite wall. Howard let his eyes wander from corner to corner on the hallway, observing the yellow-chipped surfaces of the walls and the ceiling. It reminded him faintly of how the hoarder's house looked like when it was all cluttered and removed. With an outstretched arm, he pushed open the far right door. Fred stood upright at the side of the polished wooden table, his hands behind his back and sort of half-smile spread across his face. A singular light bulb hung from the ceiling, illuminated the room and giving Howard its first proper look at the man had he so much heard about. He looked somewhere around his mid-30s, a sliver blonde of hair sitting out atop of his head, a neatly combed above his ears. His face was narrow and elonged. With his eyes, they were full of caffeine. Dark bags beneath him being the most noticeable symptom of nocturnal habits. A black bow tie was wrapped somewhat shoddily around his collar, and the rest of the outfit gave off the impression of an early 1900s gentleman. It was a pine-striped jacket and a white dress shirt, and along with the jet black suit pants. Howard took another deep breath. Still, the smell of Febreze lingered. "Please take a seat." Howard stepped into the table and dragged a cushioned chair from underneath it, making himself comfortable. The floorboards were ragged with ever so slightly uneven creaking as he shifted and leaned in towards his plate. "Our dish tonight comes from the mother's old rationing supplies. They are much more flavorful than the processed slop that they sell at the local market, I assure you. I trust you will find them quite enjoyable." "I certainly do." Again, that tiny hint of smile pierced through Fred's expression. He sat and cleared his throat, scratching the bridge of his nose before taking a napkin from his pocket and laying it on his lap. Howard looked down at his food. Two veiny sausages nestled themselves aside deep a heap of mashed potatoes, drizzled in the brown gravy-like substance. A small pile of various vegetables was scattered off to the side, soft and wet, dispersing from the touch of his fork. "Have you been enjoying the town?" Fred was already tuckling in, slicing open the sausage meat and dragging it through the river of gravy before putting it to his lips. It suddenly occurred to Howard that he had barely said a word to the man, and he fumbled internally, trying to pluck out the sentence from a whirlwind, though thoughts blowing through his brain. "Yeah, it's very quaint. I could see myself coming back here one day, when I'm old and retired." Fred stopped eating for a moment and looked at him with a kind of knowing air. "You like traveling, yes?" Howard raised an eyebrow, twirling the loose sawject strand around his fork. "How did you know?" he asked. Popping the strand into his mouth, he jolted back and forth with his tongue, trying to detect any unusual flavors. And even as he kicked himself for being so presumptuous. "People like you come and go occasionally by now. I am used to seeing them." "I see," Howard replied, swallowing his mouthful. It was spit suckling dry, but he pretended to otherwise. "Do you always invite them over for dinner?" "Well, you're the first person to respond to my letters," he replied almost sadly. "Oh, well, Fred," Howard trailed off, mumbling something vaguely unsympathetic. There was a silence for a while. He tried to fill at his mashed potatoes, unable to keep himself from stabbing at them until they were distributed across the plate like a damp layer of toilet paper. A tall looming grandfather clock ticked rhythmically as they ate, stood near the end of the table and next to a blackened fireplace. "Allow me to cut to the chase, if you please," Fred said. Suddenly he spoke, setting down his knife and fork, bridging his hands together. Howard straightened up, finishing the practically chewy string bean. "I understand the other residents of this town may have been propaganding some harmful information about me. Please, if you disclose any such things that may have been said, do not hold back, as be honest as possible." Fred stared, hands clasped together, body stiff and expectant, waiting for an answer. Howard rubbed his temple as he wondered what the best way to tell him that the entire town wanted him gone. He thought it would be strange even if he asked such a question. Surely he would have picked up on the locals' attitudes by now. A lot of people seem to be a little disturbed about your nightly walks through the graveyard." "Yes, I've gotten that great impression, though I'm not sure why. I find myself to be the only person responsible for its upkeep. Did you see the graves this morning? The cleanness of the headstones? Not to toot my own horn, but I'd say they were spotless." The graves, they looked like they were freshly dug, didn't they? Do you know who you think is responsible for that? Howard peered past Fred and noticed a soil-coated shovel in the back corner of the room. A small pile of mud and grass, blades sat beneath it. Anything else? Anything a little more specific? Fred continued. Anything, I hate to use the word, but incriminating? No, nothing like that, Howard continued, waving his hand as if to dispel the motion. The worst of it is, well, someone said you were like a vampire, with the lack of appearance during the day. Good, Fred nodded. Taking a sip of water from his glass, his shoulders relaxed, and Howard could see the weight had lifted from them. Nothing out of the ordinary, then. He then picked up his knife and fork and resumed eating, as did Howard. Once again, the unnatural silence crept in, letting his eyes wander across the room. He spied the cupboard of the antique dining ware, displaying ornate plates and gleaming cutlery. I had heard this used to be your mother's place at some point, he said, feeling that he should be at least attempt to keep the conversation going. She always said she wanted a plot of land for herself, Fred replied, in a jarring monotone voice, somewhere private and empty. I'm sorry? Fred stared at his plate. Howard froze, overcome by the terrifying feeling he had something very wrong. For where she wanted to be buried, she kept telling me when she was sick, a nice open field just for her, where she could watch the bees dance across the flowers in place, across the poppies and daffodils. Those were her favorites. She told me they reminded her of her childhood. He was deathly still. Howard chewed on his bottom lip, wringing his fingers. I had never made the arrangements. She did not tell anyone other than me, did not put it in her will, but it meant a lot to her. It really did. With a sniff, he flicked his eyes up and said, Where are you going to be buried? I have never really thought about it too much. I might be cremated, maybe. I couldn't say, really. Fred shrugged. To each of their own, I suppose. Mother did not want to be cremated. She always hated fire. Fire is what took her father away. He said it with such monochance that it took Howard a moment to process what he truly meant. Oh, I'm so... Mother used to say that was where father is now, where the fire is. I was never too sure of myself. Father was a mean man, but he didn't like the fire either. Howard's heart sank as he noticed the family's picture on the wall. It hung crookedly, and the glass layered with dust and the frame chipped and stained. From the dim lighting, he could make out two smiling faces, one far less cheerfully looking man, arms crossed firmly at his chest as he glared at the camera. Well, what a lovely evening this has been. Fred scooped up his last forkful of mashed potatoes and swallowed it. His plate empty, Howard reached for his knife and fork, realizing that he had a good few bites to go before he was finished. No, please, Fred spoke, standing up and sweeping up the plate from his hands. If you're full, you're full. Oh, I will not force you to eat more than you wish. He then turned to his heel and walked past through the kitchen door, before Howard could say a word. Brushing a couple of gravy droplets of his trousers, he stood up, pushing the chair back under the table. I don't think I ever caught your name, Fred said, as he entered the room again, wiping his hands with a cloth. It's, Howard. It's nice meeting you, Howard. Howard stared at the door, expecting Fred to follow behind, only for him to vanish back into the kitchen from the corner of his eye. He halted, taking one last moment to fully observe the room, knowing that it would most likely be the last time he would ever see it. He opened the door into the hallway and made his way back to the front door. As he reached for the knob, he heard the pitter-patter of fast footsteps creaking through the dining room. He turned. Fred came around the corner, red-faced. He kept walking until he was uncomfortably close. Fidgeting as he started with bulging white eyes, Howard retracted as far back as he could, his head tilted upwards to lay against the scratchy wooden surface of the front door. I want to ask you something. Fred's voice was left to no imprint on the cool, calm, collected man Howard had conversed with moments ago. You said you might come back here one day. Did you not? When were you old and retired? Yes, I did. If someone you love wanted something, Fred said, not missing a beat. something you love more than anything else in the entire world, and you had the opportunity to give it to them, would you do it? Would you not? Would you take that opportunity? Panic forced Howard to blurt out the thing he could think of. I would, I would, I would, I would, I would. He kept repeating it over and over again, quieter each time, until it didn't even seem like a sentence anymore. Fred let out a deep sigh and backed away, running his hand across his scalp. Then you would understand, he whispered. Grinning, he chuckled squeakily, in a rhythmic chuckle, sitting down as he reached the base of the stairs. Goodbye, Howard. I wish you well. Good things are coming your way. Howard peeled open the front door. Fred waved as he closed it behind him, still grinning. His heart was pounding. He stood outside the front door what felt like hours, until he heard Fred's footsteps recede upstairs. Cautiously he backed his way from the house, half expecting to catch a glimpse of Fred's ghostly figure through one of the second-story windows. No such apparition was seen. However, Howard's racing mind calmed as he began to walk home. Opening his front door, he almost jumped out of his skin as the phone rang. It was the writing agency he applied to. He got the job, and they wanted him to start as soon as possible. They apologized for calling him so late, but Howard didn't care. He thanked the woman and the other end and hung up, promptly falling asleep on the sofa. When he woke up, he started packing his things, too excited to reflect on much previous night's dinner. Leaving so soon? A local called out from across the street as Howard left the house. I hope the antics of you-know-who hadn't put you off of our town. Howard reassured the man that he went on his way, informing him of his new profession. Nobody knew of his visitation to the mansion, and he was intent on keeping it that way. The last he saw of the town was well-kept graveyard in his rearview mirror as he pulled out into the country roads. For a mere moment, he thought he could see Fred leaning over a gravestone, watching and waving him goodbye as the maddening grin still spread across his face. Howard clutched the walking stick in his hand tightly as he stood at the entrance to St. Anthony. From a simple glance down the main road, he could tell that any remainder of human life had vanished years ago. The houses were faded and empty, some half collapsed, others with caved-in roofs and missing walls. The grass and the trees were sullen and gray, wilted and dying. The house he had rented for his stay had brittle plywood nailed into the window frames. The front door sealed off. It was far different from the atmosphere to one he remembered from all those years ago. As he walked through the forgotten town, he remembered the last piece of news he heard relating to his existence in the evacuation. All had chose to leave their part from one stubborn individual and will barricade themselves inside their mansion. Fred was never heard from again, and the town was abandoned. Some said he never left, and why he turned the corner at the last past rotten willow trees to face the force of the mansion. Howard saw why. The building itself crumbled down outwards, towards the ground. It looked like a few mere years away from being swallowed completely. Far more noticeable, of course, it was the enormous mass of floral engulfing the house, intertwined with the brick woodwork erupting from the wood floors and walls. Several stories high, it swayed peacefully with the wind, like a chest full of animal rising with falling each breath. A rainbow of flowers was cast across the heap of green, like a kaleidoscope, shimmering and twinkling in the sunlight. Howard swallowed, unsure of how to feel. He glanced around, wondering if Fred was still lurking somewhere in the distance, but he saw nothing. Slowly he carried towards the graveyard, expecting to find a similar arrangement of flora. Instead, he found was each and every headstone had been ripped off from its place and cast aside in the streets. The places which had been previously laid had been smoothed over with grass as if they never existed, and also the field was bare, save for the existence of a single isolated grave right in the center. Howard recognized its worn texture, kneeling of its expression and wiping away the dirt. Here lies Jessica Hazelton, loving wife, mother of one, and dearly missed by all who knew her. Was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. A healthy covering of poppies and daffodils emerged from around the headstone, and a piece of paper was tucked into the soil beneath them. Howard had picked up the paper and unfolded it, slipping his reading glasses on. "I knew you'd understand," it read, written in Fred's handwriting. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.